Welcome. A few notices before we start. This is an informal gathering. Our session is being recorded and it will only be broadcast later. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please do switch off your camera and microphone. This is the sixth event as part of our advanced studies group on sacred space on the topic presence, person, beauty. We've been organizing these sessions with Father Peter Newby of St. Mary's University. Our next session will be on the 29th of March. That will be with Professor Fabio Barry from Stanford University, who will be talking to us on the question, why round temples? And we are all, of course, very much looking forward to hearing him on that topic, either remotely or in person in our office. As you know, there's also another series we've been doing in collaboration with London Met in parallel to this one, and that's on the living memory of cities. The next session will be with Dr. Dagmar Weston from the University of Edinburgh. Dagmar will be talking about Roman theatres, Seine, France, as a thematic edifice. That will be on the 15th of March. Back to our series on sacred space. Today we have with us Professor Peter Carl from London Met, who many of us will remember from Cambridge and also Harvard. And the title of Peter's talk today is the question, Ugly Truth, Ideal Beauty. As always, the proceedings will be very simple. Eric will be chairing the session. Peter will be doing his keynote presentation for about 30 minutes or so, and this will be followed by the usual period for questions. Father Peter Newby, who usually opens the questions, can't be with us today as he's attending the monthly meeting of canons at Westminster Cathedral, but I trust any of those attending will be glad to help out with opening that dialogue. Finally, a note to thank Joanne Gold, Nikolina Georgieva, and Duncan MacDonald, who have been assisting with these sessions at Eric Parry Architects, and our graphics team, in particular Russell Watson and Roman McCook, who have been updating our website and events program. And I would now give the floor to Eric. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Jose, and simply warmest greetings to Peter, and with great expectations. We're really privileged to have this occasion. I only wish actually it could be again in this space, so that's almost possible, I believe. I know it becomes more difficult for friends from far away, but in some ways to get back to the seminar format would be terrific next year. So very much hoping for that. But Peter, thank you, and we're looking forward greatly.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be asked. I'm sorry this one goes on a little longer than the last one, and I'll probably be editing on the fly in order to make up time. Can we go to the screen, please? Okay, you don't need to see me then, but you do need to see this. Okay, this begins with Peter Newby, who brought me a photograph of a recently completed chapel in the suburbs of London that looked like it had arrived in a flat pack, one chapel, brown. And he complained that people just didn't understand the sacred. And I've been thinking about this, in particular in relation to modernism's emphasis upon austere conditions. And notice that the famous, I think I've showed you this before, the famous Lucan image of a room, perhaps influenced by Antonello Damascena's St. Jerome, takes place in a Cistercian apse with a fireplace. This is the upper end of this motif rather than the abject chapel that Peter showed me. I was also appreciative, as this series has gone on, of Michael Lang's review of Catholic's prescriptions and that kind of writing from, in the Greek tradition, Maximus Confessor, to, in the Latin tradition, Durandus Borromeo and Bellarmine. And finally, I got stimulated by the discussion that erupted between David and Christian concerning latent festival, also touched on by Nick, possibly sacred. And this led to an exploration of kinds of religious understanding in relation to poetics. Next, please. Jose's right that the Caravaggio is influenced by the Franciscan tradition, but the tradition goes back to things like the Desert Fathers. And in the early Renaissance, a motif developed that you see at the bottom of your screen of where the Greek tradition, Christ is born and dies in a cave, as it were. In the Latin tradition, he's born in a crib, and this is inserted into the ruins of monumental imperial masonry. And it's a triumph over Roman pagan imperialism in the New Age of Grace. The humble wood hut occupying the previous stone ruins. This, however, presents a problem insofar as the revival of classical architecture, literature, and thought lay at the core of the Renovatio, of which Nick spoke a couple of sessions ago. This problem has its origins in Constantine, who first brought the traditions of imperial rulership into relations of notions of the kingdom of heaven, which Pseudo-Dionysius would eventually term hierarchy. At Santa Pudenziana, in the upper left, we have the Savior Christ as teacher, judge, and Lord, figures who would naturally appear in a niche of this kind according to Roman custom. The hill of Golgotha is behind him, and it has been proposed that the exedra that you see right behind the group that includes the apostles and the Jewish and Gentile churches recalls the site of the church and Anastasis Rotunda in Jerusalem, founded under Constantine. The image is on your right, and probably the second from the top is the one we're thinking of. This mosaic is only about 50 years after the dedication of that church, and so it's possible to see the mosaic depicting the metamorphosis of the church or ecclesia from earthly to heavenly Jerusalem at the eschaton. You see the tetramorph in the sky behind the jeweled cross on Golgotha. The Christology and the material and temporal analogical transformations attendant upon salvation here will preoccupy the church forever afterwards. Next, please. It's not technical questions which inhibit churches of this ambition. And by the way, I'm not absolutely thinking of the need to invoke churches of this degree of elaboration so much as I am about the confusion concerning how to manifest a sacred space and where that's coming from. At any rate, it's not a technical question, since all over Europe they reconstructed churches after the war, and you've seen the Frauenkirche. The issue must lie elsewhere. Next slide, please. As a basic entry into the nature of the difference, here's Wirzenheiligen from the middle of the 18th century, placed next to the Chapel of La Tourette from the middle of the 20th, to the same scale. La Tourette is about 2/3 the size of Wirzenheiligen, but the most notable difference is in the vertical articulation. Wirzenheiligen has a complex history, which I'm not going to go through here in detail, involving a dispute between the Catholic Prince Bishop Friedrich Karl Graf von Schönbrunn and the Protestant leading abbot Mösinger and his favorite architect, a guy called Heinrich Krone. Neumann's original design had the site of the pilgrimage altar at the crossing, but Mösinger and Krone moved the church 10 meters east, supposedly to save on the cost of the foundations on the hill. The church walls had reached 3 meters high when Neumann and the bishop discovered that this displaced the original pilgrimage altar from the site of the original miracle. That is to say, that pilgrimage altar is built on the site of a young lad in the 15th century who was visited by the 14 holy helpers, as they're called. It's a cult that has its roots in Byzantium, but grew up in Germany in the Middle Ages. And so Neumann adapted the design. He left the 3-meter high wall and he adapted design to restore the altar to its original intended site. There was a 30-year construction period, all the original participants were dead when the thing was finished in 1772. Now, the next two photographs are both taken in roughly the same place, and I can't point to it, so it's just beyond, it's at the crossing of Wiertzenheiligen, and it's just beyond the high altar in La Tourette. Next slide, please. Thank you. Brilliant. The obvious difference between the two buildings is apparent visually. One hardly needs to say anything. We have the luminous vertical descent from the Trinity and Mary to the earthly historical imagery via the mediation of ornament, from circular halo via the ovals and round within square of Wiertzenheiligen to the metamorphic altar of the 14 holy helpers on the left, versus in La Tourette, a horizontal telluric darkness articulated by pockets of light and color. Notice the altar. In Le Corbusier lui-même, he referred to the altar as a site of bloody sacrifice, and the original design had the floor of La Tourette down at ground level, a whole 2.5 stories below. So it was like a Mayan hill. Bataille, with whom Le Corbusier spent a fair amount of time at Vézelay during the war, expressed what's going on here. Quote, "There exists an equivalence between war, ritual, sacrifice, and mystical life. It is the same play of ecstasies and terrors that join mankind to the games of the heavens. Death is the great affirmation. The wonderstruck cry of life in death reveals life in its plenitude and dissolves the order of the real," by which he meant economic claims. Okay, next slide. Now, to save time, I'm not going to go through this, but because he's recorded it, you can read this. It's simply a more detailed comparison between what's similar and what's different between Wiertzenheiligen and La Tourette. And the primary difference is the replacement of God and salvation, though the church at La Tourette obviously works perfectly well as a church, with Le Corbusier's notion of l'espace indicible, a kind of confrontation with transcendence that is indicible, unspeakable. Okay, but basically what we're dealing with in both is a question of the status of the worshiper in relation to the fundamental cosmic conditions. Okay, next, please. Agreeing that beauty incarnates truth, as Dagmar argued following Plato, is this truth universal or particular to believers? For example, both Christianity and Islam had both Alhazen and Neoplatonism at about the same time. However, in Christianity, it developed into the world of horizons, openings, and obviously figuration, whereas in Islam, these are both churches from the late period, the 17th century, or both sacred buildings, it developed as a differentiation of the one to the many in a more remote architectural order. Next image, please. Or more dramatically, the Mayan case is built on a general truth regarding the individual's finitude with respect to natural processes, involving rites that enabled eventual blending with Christianity that one still sees today, even if that conversion was assisted by soldiers, book burnings, and so on. And the whole is set within the remarkable 4 temporal cycles calibrated against celestial movements. So briefly, what's going on here? On the left is the so-called Tlaloc mountain. This is a motif that you see in a variety of forms, from Peru all the way up to Southwest America. And here it's represented in a late fresco from Teotihuacan. And you see it as both water and blood, with the sacrifice of humans contributing to life as a whole, which is going on around it. This is part of the background to perfectly sensible and, in fact, quite inventive agricultural processes, enabling the Mayans to cope with their given topography. In the upper right is Mayan iconography emerging into archaeology. It's the earliest fresco we have, also the earliest writing. And it's the remains of a temple that, like most of these things, got buried beneath a later pyramid. And its west wall presents a kind of establishment of the cosmic order. And what you see in the middle is repeated 4 times, i.e. for the 4 cosmic trees. That is to say, there's a tree with what's called the principal bird deity in its branches. Before it is a sacrifice, and there are different sacrifices for each of the 4 trees. This one is a stag with 3 stones on its belly that marks the hearth that's supposedly the foundation of house. And next to it is a hunter deity, one of the founder deities, who is auto-sacrificing, i.e. he's put a sea urchin spine or a jade spindle through his penis to shed blood. Next slide, please. Now this may look violent. It's certainly less decorous than circumcision, though it involves the same organ. But if you've been to the British Museum and seen the remarkable lintels with their unbelievably careful carving, you can even trace the weaves in the cloth. You see that this business of auto-sacrifice is one of the obligations of rulership. And here you see in the lower right, the Lady Kabakshuk drawing a string with jade flints or thorns through her tongue, letting blood into papers, while her consort, the Lord Shield Jaguar, as he's called, who is refounding this this temple in the site. And she sees a Tlaloc figure who opens its mouth. You see the helmet on the figure is repeated on the lower left, and he's holding the staff of office, appears to her, and it's all conducted with great sort of dignity and self-effacement. Next image. And on the north wall is this Tlaloc cave, which you see drawn on the left, in which appears the maize god, who presents maize in the form of tamales and water as part of a series of gifts of the earth, standing on the feathered serpent, both chthonic and celestial. Next. Now, just a minute on how all of this works. I'm looking at Copan, and again, we don't have time to go through this in great detail. You'll see on the left a temple that was preserved inside the main pyramid called La Rosalila. Usually these are destroyed, ritually destroyed, but this one was preserved intact. And you'll see in the lower right of its facade this emblem, which includes the 3 ancestors and images for the name of Kinich Yakhukmo, who's the figure you see in the center in the lower right. He's the founder of the civilization at Copan, and he comes from Teotihuacan, as you can see from the goggles that he wears. This is him as a censor. And so he's all these pyramids are built over his tomb. But this business of representing him, you see the Tlaloc figure in the steps to the left of him, surrounded by skulls. And up above, you see one of the forms of appearance of the rulers is commemorated in these stelae, which are given dates according to the long count. And this is just a part of it, where you see these emblems of rulership and whereby the motifs with which they're involved, both natural and royal, are worn as clothing, and the figure appears the tendency is to see it as a manifestation of power. It's also obvious that the figure is completely trapped in its ritual circumstances. On the right is the altar that was commemorated by the last ruler, whose base is surrounded by all the rulers previous to him, and that's King Mo confronting the last ruler at the bottom, handing him a staff of office. And on the top is a script that, take it from me, and I'm taking it from people like David Stewart, who can actually read these hieroglyphs. It's the history of how King Mo came to found Copan. And you'll see that the hieroglyphs, the iconography of implements, the temples, the costumes, all have this aggregative iconography. And it's possible that this density or compression of meanings may have been the basis of the famous Maya collapse of around 800. What got lost was the representational elite. The figures, the rest of the people simply set up lesser settlements in the jungle, as they always had, and still preserve a lot of their rights in to this day in dialogue with Christianity. And in fact, a lot of these sacrifices and several of the motifs enabled them to communicate with Christianity. Okay, next, please. If beauty incarnates truth, does it turn on the rights, the time out of time? I wish to introduce into this conversation a bit of sacramental theology, or Christian sacramental theology. The term sacramentum translates the Greek mysterion. Of an extremely complex topic, I will address only two aspects, marked here by the two sacraments which have received the most attention in Christian theological examination, baptism and the Eucharist. The first of these aspects is the doctrine of ex opere operato. Though the phrase is medieval, the issue dates to the Augustinian controversy with the Donatists and declares that the efficacy of the rite depends upon its proper performance and the preparedness of the recipient. It does not depend on the purity of the sacrificand or of the person conducting it, i.e., a corrupt priest properly conducting the rite means that the rite is still efficacious. Accordingly, all participants are claimed by the situation and its setting. It's like a literal interpretation of Dasein. This business of getting of assuring the efficacy is one of the sources of dogmatic writing. In the case of baptism, we have the familiar death and rebirth from water. Notice that Maya has the same thing, though in Christianity it's personal, whereas Maya, it celebrates a rebirth of life in general, set in the Italian tradition deriving from the Constantinian baptistry, which in the form that you know it is actually from Sixtus III in the 5th century, overlaid with 16th and 17th and 18th century architecture. It's 4-quartered. It celebrates the 8th day after creation and of ascension. Next image, please. Okay, I'm just gonna mention this because we're gonna start running out of time. What's going on here is a similar attention to ritual as the basis for order. Literally everybody in their place, and in the case of the Mingtang, the capacity to circle through the cycle of seasons. It's related to what Eric was talking about with respect to law courts, where everybody's position is the basis for their influence on the discussion and their capacity to speak, in the Chinese example, set within a cosmic context. Okay, next image, please. The second aspect of sacramental theology that I want to touch on is as a visible means to invisible grace, which again is very ancient and still preserved within Catholic doctrine. One sees it already in Augustine, where he speaks of through bodily things to the invisible things, incorporeal things. I'm using Hugh of Saint Victoire here. I could have used several others. He's part of the tradition of the Neoplatonic tradition of which Augustine is a part. And I'm taking these remarks from his famous book on the sacraments in the 12th century. He sees the creation of light, which is the thing with which God is explicitly declared to have created, as itself a great sacrament because it opens the dialectics between the visible and the invisible. And he speaks of a sacramental history, beginning with Noah and ending in Christ. Avoiding all hint of, or any hint of what you might call cannibalism, he speaks of Christ's immortal body because he is mortal by choice, as what is commemorated and celebrated in the Eucharist. And he says there's 3 things necessary for the sacrament of the Eucharist: the appearance of the bread and wine, whereby the actuality of the visible grants the actuality of the invisible, the truth of the body of Christ, and spiritual grace. With respect to the latter, he says, by the words of sanctification, the true substance of the bread and wine is changed into the true body and blood of Christ. And earlier, discussing baptism, he declares that a sacrament is a corporal or material element representing by similitude, signifying by institution, i.e., requiring the Catholic Church, containing by sanctification some invisible and spiritual grace. And he compares it to the relation of word to sense. And this will have a huge significance for what follows. And he says, ultimately, it has a mystic significance where the entire church is the body of Christ. And that's what's celebrated in Raphael's famous fresco, where these biblical figures surround the deesis of the Trinity with Mary and John the Baptist, and are echoed by historical figures discussing the transubstantiation, which of course is the vanishing point of the composition, standing opposite Philosophia, as you know. And he populates it with people because they embody what they stand for, i.e. it's a kind of imitation of the process of hermeneutics that I'm addressing through the sacrament. He refers to the adornment of churches by saying that they don't confer sanctification, but they're nonetheless sacred because they pertain to holy things. And he describes it, he goes through the process of how a church is consecrated and summarizes this under, and interestingly, the figure of four corners and the center, which we've seen elsewhere, is replicated by drawing with wine, water, and oil and ashes on the altar, the crosses in the center and four corners. He describes it as a house to be dedicated is a soul to be sanctified. This business of the visible means to invisible grace is a primary intuition of what it means to be human. Among whatever else Christianity is, it's an extraordinary hermeneutics of the invisible. Everything for which matters to Christianity, God, heaven, the soul, grace, spirit, the eschaton, prevails in the invisible, except for Christ, who of course prevails in both worlds, and remains for that reason, as the incarnation, the focus of interpretation regarding grace and salvation. It comes accompanied by the extraordinary corpus of subtle thought and writing, in which there prevails an important dialectic between interior and exterior, between qualities like faith, compassion, understanding, and the nature of the whole. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, Dalibor interestingly argues that poetics is ontological, whereas aesthetics is not, for which his leading example is the Gesamtkunstwerk. And as my example, I've chosen the Palau de Música Catalana, which you probably know, with its, I mean, in general, Art Nouveau is a Gesamtkunstwerk, being supposedly free of all earlier traditions. And this quasi-church-like interior with its stained glass windows and its side aisles, I mean, it looks remarkably like a Frauenkirche in its basic configuration. With its unbelievable carvings at the Seine-Frons, where girls singing the flowers of May are paired with the Ride of the Valkyries from Wagner's Valkyrie, and Beethoven is paired with Anselm Clave, who is responsible for resurrecting folk music, and folk music is paired with classical music, a tree with a Doric column. You can see where I'm coming from on this. However, it does raise the question of what is poetics. Insofar as it arises out of Aristotle and tragic drama carries a speculative relation to the rites and ceremonies of the polis. Does this therefore mean that the sacred requires poetics, i.e. analogy or similitude? But poetics itself is not necessarily sacred, though of course sacred things were customarily represented in poetry prior to moving into philosophy and prose. One of the key emphases of Aristotle is, of course, mimesis, and he refers to it as the mimesis of life at the beginning and later as the mimesis of praxis, which involves a dialectics between morals and ethics. And this, of course, attracts Augustine's convergence of the aptum and the pulchrum. Poetics is, of course, rooted in language. Poetry is, first of all, language. And it's I would wish to expand language from written or spoken language to all of our modes of involvement as lingual, what Dalibor used to refer to as linguality, from the German Sprachlichkeit. In any case, poetry becomes a paradigm of how the world's meaning holds together and of creativity, particularly after Romanticism, where, however, it begins to migrate to the interior and the transcendent psyche becomes something like psychology. In The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty's primary insight is that we do not live, it's impossible to have an ontological void. This therefore means that language is always the site of the hidden and the revealed, the dialectics that so preoccupied Heidegger. If in general we're speaking of something like an honesty to our situatedness in being, and being is therefore fundamentally metaphoric, it requires the analogical imagination to participate in the world soul. We're not restricted to practical evolvements alone, like the non-human life. One can see how importance gets accorded to the movement from the sensible to the intelligible, what Dalibor called ontological movement, or at least part of what he called it. Therefore, to the eventual association of intellection with the divine or the sacred. What, of course, is different from the tradition I've just been discussing in the present is the absence of the articulate mediation between the cosmic conditions and human finitude, and why Dalibor kept invoking the catena rerum. Because without that, one's left with a choice between the sublime or the poetics of everyday life. And with regard to the sublime, one naturally thinks of Rudolf Alto, Richard Wagner, as well as, of course, Le Corbusier's L'Espace Indicible. However, I want to spend the rest of this on the problem of the poetics of everyday life and how that has qualified our notions. Next, please. And I'm going to race through this because a lot of it is familiar. The famous phrase of Le Corbusier, some things are sacred, others are not, whether they are not, they are religious, comes to fruition in Ronchon, where, to cut a long story short, you have a kind of mourning devoted to one's involvement with Mary and the Christ child in the glass box of the oculus, so reenacting one of the ancient metaphors for the incarnation as light passing through a glass vessel, but possibly also echoing Le Corbusier's paradigmatic woman who stands as a kind of moral counterform. And in the evening, the appearance of the bull in the south facade and his painting done on Pentecost when they moved the cross off center, which carries, you see the dark oculus, several references to Ronchon, and depicts Pasiphae giving birth to the bull. And so you have the man God and the man creature. On the right, incidentally, is a standard depiction of the Pentecost, of the descent of the Holy Spirit on the apostles and Mary, often compared to baptism. I don't know why it isn't more frequently invoked in discussions of vault and light iconography. But anyway, next, please. What that also raises is the possible comparison, which you've seen me do before, between the artist's drafting table and the altar as a place of sacrifice, in accordance with romantic notions of the artist. Next, please. Because in all the discussion concerning secularization, which usually gravitates around the loss of the Ptolemaic universe and the decentering of the deity, is the counterform of the sacralization of the elements of everyday life, which you first begin to see in something like the Merode altarpiece of the early 15th century, Robert Campin, which takes place in a standard bourgeois, Burgundian bourgeois home, which will become the basis for things like the still life of Peter Cleisch on the lower left. And if you read the caption to this image of a kitchen in Savoie, you read that the kitchen is not precisely the sanctuary of the house, but it's certainly one of the most important places. The kitchen and the salon are where one lives. This table starts on a fireplace in the living room in the salon, and passes through water to arrive in the foreground of this image. And as you know on the right, and that's the sum total of cooking in this modern kitchen, is a bain-marie and a hot plate, which pick up those themes and pick up the horizon along the backsplash. And of course, in the middle is this broken bread and a coffee urn made from seeds in heated water, white bread and black coffee, placed against an emasculated chair, which suggests that breakfast is being seen as something ritualistic. Is it? The tangle of legs that recall the pilotis of the building become a square and right rectangle in the window behind. Next. In fact, that's part of a configuration one sees often in Le Corbusier of a double square and right rectangle that captures both the, shall we call them ritual implements, as well as the bottom of the chair. Next. And can be seen, for example, in his supposed derivation of the Ronchon d'Or. And you see in the bottom left an upper and a lower with an upside down star. So a kind of conflict between above and below, which is next. Rehearsed at the end of the poem de l'Angledois, where the bull and its labyrinth appear as a double square. It appears that the double square itself incarnates this conflict and reciprocity that results in a configuration of some meaning. Next. In general, Le Corbusier has seen nature as more as a series of emblems than as the Mayans did as a problem of cultivation and feeding and nurturing, much after the fashion of somebody like Robert Flood's microcosms. Next, we're going to move quickly here for the. So, for example, the sun is seen as a series of obvious elements, but also this notion of giving a measure where the division in half allows him to see a comparison between the temporal order and geometry inscribed on a stone that eventually results in the stone that he found that he saw as a self-portrait, which is also black and white. So a way of moving via stone and geometry between the individual and the whole. And of course, it's something like Savoie, you get two ramps, that one dark, one light. And from Fulcanelli, we find out that this solar cycle is a symbol of the apocalypse. And so you get that remarkable image in the lower right of a north-facing oculus, apparently shedding rays of light, created by the shadows of a western sun. Next. And similarly, an absolutely primary experience of the tides on the Brittany foreshore, where you get two contradictory phenomena, one a land of dreams, and the other a geometric phenomenon that in his lectures in Précision he called the place of all measure, the right angle. We're dealing with the affiliation of the sea, which on the one hand is death and renewal, on the other hand, the horizon, and that as a contribution to the coincidentia oppositorum of dissolution and dispersion and constitution and relationships that will characterize l'espace indicible. Next. And with apologies to Chris, I want to recover some of the story behind this building. He described it as the first time that he learned to compose with fragments, or as he called them, in organs independent of one another. The thing divides the site between north and south and allows a species of English garden to pass beneath the slab. And of course, we're already in trouble because he clearly intends the colony of scholars, Swiss scholars, he intends to evoke one of his paradigms of the Ville Radieuse, the Certosa d'Ema. Remember that cave that he drew that was actually discovered beneath the building when they set the foundations. Next, rather, before we go that, notice that he's organized them in layers, from new to old, from glass and steel through perforated masonry to polished masonry to rubble masonry. As you pass north. Next, please. The critical is that lens wall. It sits at the bottom of the opaque, it supports the opaque wall. It's actually, of course, supported by the columns, but it is, which have been split apart because of the movement joint and made to imply a kind of illusion of depth. And perhaps the columns arising from the bookcases involve something related to memory. In any case, passage through that lens wall has a kind of mystical quality. Next. The vestibule itself is given special attention. It takes a 19th century convention and sees it as a place of decision where you can move in any one of several directions. You're initiated into it by a tetrapylon, and in the image at the top, you see he's taken a little bit of extra care whereby the book reflects the airfoil column. There's a cup that's been whited out that's paired with the column behind it that itself has been whited out, and the reflection of the top of the lens wall has been dropped into the glass table and made to continue in the chair leg, thus creating a kind of illusionistic lens wall in front of the wall, which is enhanced by the shadow coming off the lens wall parallel and tangent to the table. Next. So he's playing between the photographs and the actual building. Within that vestibule is this extraordinary double room that floats on the across the landing for the staircase. Next. Sorry, I'm ripping through this because you're familiar with it. It employs a configuration that he's used ever since La Roche of confronting, instead of meeting passage with an apse, as you'd expect from the École des Beaux-Arts, it's a convex curve with walls that are oblique in plan, stairs that are oblique in elevation, leading, I mean, it takes advantage of the obvious condition, it's darker on the ground floor and lighter on the upper floor. According to his matchbook matchbox with a perspectival cave supporting a frontal frame. Next. And to which, particularly in a institution devoted to scholars, one naturally thinks of something like Plato's cave, where the ascent from ambiguous darkness to south-oriented light includes transferring the artifacts in the table in the foreground of one to the table in the middle of the room of the scholar. Next. And that foyer includes an interesting pun on cell, both the monk's cell, as we've been noticing, and elsewhere in the Oeuvre Complète, he speaks of a town whose structures based on the principle of the biological cell is in demand. And on the airfoil column are micrographs, and on the back wall are macrographs. He originally wanted to leave the back wall rubble, but the head of the institute wouldn't allow it. But there's a kind of lensing that takes place and a kind of metaphor of projection. As you can see in the diagram at the bottom, across the foil column, which also invokes macrocosm, microcosm, or microcosm, macrocosm. Next. And of course, we arrive at Chris's table, which I merely inscribe within similar tables, and therefore its mortuary qualities join with its gray and white, which rhymes with the photographs, to set up a general thematic of what these tables at the end of the procession might indicate. Next, and for anyone who is wondering if that image was also governed by a geometry similar to that at Poissy, which was done about the same time, it is. It's made by a square whose height and distance from the corner is then shifted to the bottom of the image to make the right rectangle, and the corners of that square capture the two sides of the obliques. There's a major one that's blue, whose perpendicular goes from the corner of the whole figure to its center, and the green that goes to the other corner, whose perpendicular goes from the other corner to where the blue meets the center of the angle droit. And we have the plant and the lamp again. And you'll notice that the blue one comes off a horizon. And I realized that this photograph is actually quite unusual in the Corbusier's Oeuvre. And so began to wonder if, in fact, it pertained to the order of the building as a whole. Next. And indeed it does, and this is much less chaotic than it looks. It's similar to the figure that you've seen already from the Ronchamp doors, involving three orders: the white squares, the expanding red diagonals. Notice particularly the one in the foyer where the horizon meets the central white square at the airfoil column. And you can see by the junction with the blue order, which is the diagonals that I showed you before, why that table is where it is and why that strange photograph of a corner might have been taken. Next. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of this. All I want to get at is that by transforming perfectly good situational understanding into a kind of purist vision, i.e., by rendering it all, as it were, to optics, and by having the iconography of measure, i.e., the grids and the rhythms, afflicted by conflict, so they are both harmony and violence, he's able to draw metaphorically on rituals that he imports from elsewhere. So notions like house as a temple, sacrifice, are metaphors, which in turn relate to his notion of l'espace indicible as a kind of frontier of the transcendent. Last slide, please. Okay, a group of images of painting attempting to cope with the Christian inheritance from what might be called the Northern European Expressionism, juxtaposed with the image you've seen before, ultimately having its roots in Erigena. Clearly influenced by his Christian inheritance, Heidegger declared, quote, "Being is the transcendence, pure and simple." It's not clear that the Mayans had a notion of transcendence. Rather, they lived in a milieu of concrete involvements with implications alternately propitious and threatening. At the same time, like the Chinese, coming together in propitious spatial arrangements, which aligned rulership with the fundamental natural conditions and the ancestors, establish a time out of time, which enabled them to reflect upon the flow of everyday existence. The opposite of transcendence is human finitude. And of course, death and its analog infirmity are regularly invoked in the rites, usually under the rubric of sacrifice, regarded variously between a gift and a penalty. Often accompanied by judgment, it's hard not to recall the Anaximander fragment here in the Nietzsche translation. Once things have their origin, there they must also pass away according to necessity, for they must pay penalty and be judged for their injustice according to the ordinance of time. We have here the basis for a sacramental interpretation of life. The spatiality of our modes of involvement is one of the greatest contributions to the experience of transcendence. The spatiality underlying the transcendence of being has both an extensive ontic dimension, manifest in the topography of embodying claims and affordances, from objects ready to hand, to furniture, to architecture, to the urban or rural context, or an urban or rural context. And on the other hand, an intensive ontological dimension, manifest in the movement or communication between embodiment and articulation, bearing echoes of the movement between chthonic and celestial. Architecture, considered as an horizon for praxis, offers a microcosm of this larger conditions, which allows us, as it were, to take transcendence for granted. Since Romanticism, the ancient dialectics of interior and exterior has gravitated around the properties of the interior life as something like psychology. As Dalibor points out with respect to surrealism, the house is a metaphor for the imagination. In the midst of a whole ever more obscure to us, and expressed in a language of mathematics and technology, we have cultivated a species of sanctification of everyday life as a manifestation of the so-called rights of the individual. This has allowed us to neglect our obligation to the whole, which was a truth acknowledged by the ancient cosmologies and is probably the basis for any plausible notion of beauty. I apologize for the length. Thank you very much for hanging around.
Thank you hugely. That's extraordinary in its breadth and its resonances with all that's come before, actually. So it's my duty to organize the inevitable cascade of questions. So I wonder who is going to begin.
I won't be hurt if you have no questions.
Christian, please.
I'll have a go. Peter, that was amazing. A real trawl around some amazing places and ideas, and tying it up together with Corb and Corb's building in a little bit more detail than I did.
That's okay. I just couldn't resist. Sorry, it was on it had come up before, and so I felt it was a useful thing to.
No, that was
Anyway,
great.
yes.
It was really interesting. It's a simple question I have, which is the difference.
Yeah, the hard ones.
The difference between knowledge and experience, really, and the way in which, how much of what you have described do you think that knowledge is a critical part of access to the experience, if you like, or how much of it is implicit? I know it's a big question, and it varies probably from place.
It's not a simple question.
No, it's not. But I think probably for me, let me just give you time to have a think. It's that there's a sort of a depth of experience that you're alluding to, and it's a bit like the idea that a metaphor can be a simple metaphor, but becomes more complex with greater knowledge, if you like. So that the relationship can be set up as a tension, but the depth of that tension is, in a sense, to a certain extent, controlled or mediated, or not mediated is the wrong word, bounded, if you like, by knowledge. But I'm interested in this relationship between knowledge and experience, because so much of what you described is incredibly rich.
There is certainly in the popular imagination a confusion regarding experience and phenomenology. Most people you still see it even in, people who should know better. They refer to the phenomenological aspects of something. What they mean is tactility.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting aspects to me of Dalibor's notion of a latent world is it always has a positive value for him, i.e. it's access to something that gives us potentially a depth and richness of meaning. Whereas what's in fact latent is more like what Merleau-Ponty described under this business of the impossibility of an ontological void. We are already on the way to meaning, and yet as soon as we start to grasp it, we leave out meanings that we also have. So there's a spontaneous dimension to it, and there's an articulate dimension to it. And the relation with the vertical generally stands for the horizontal. When I refer to the two dimensions of spatiality of being as ontic and ontological, one hopes that the vertical will stand for the horizontal. As I prefer something along those lines rather than the chiasmus that Merleau-Ponty in fact gets into. I don't think you're ever ignorant completely. And on the one hand, and on the other, it's certainly possible to get so wrapped around knowledge as words and language that you end up in a kind of philosophical or theological forensics that means in order to hold the primary meaning in place, you have the capacity, the intelligence, the literacy, which certainly exceeds mine, to do a kind of Aquinas. It was one of the few attempts to put all of being in a book. And it's interesting how rare that is. I mean, it's indicative of both an approach to being that requires that many words and those kinds of words, those very careful discriminations, and a capacity to do it, a capacity to align knowledge with experience. What's going through my mind at the same time is the complete collapse of that articulated dimension in something like Rudolf Otto's notion of the mysterium tremendum, where the experience of the divine or the sacred, it's already a concept, is, of the sublime. It's fundamentally emotional. And the indicible of Le Corbusier is an aspect of that, whereby one is simply reduced to one's finitude. The other thing about the knowledge, and one of the key things about the knowledge, and why I speak of language as linguality, is that it, and I call it I put it in with all the other modes of involvement, is that it's one aspect of communication. It's one aspect of sharing, which of course always involves conflict as well as collaboration. And the business of writing and of sharing puts a different value, or performing, puts a different value on the write, or on the book, or on the performance, than just the raw experience. So what you're calling knowledge would, I suggest, be in fact one's cultural situatedness. And sometimes you do that just with your body by bowing or shaking hands, depending on where you are. Other times you do that through long texts. Or in this case, long PowerPoints.
Thanks, Peter.
Maurice, please.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Thanks again. It's
Hi, Maurice.
wonderful to hear that, which I'm. It's just so rich, and grasping it all is difficult, but very rewarding when you get even a little gobbit out of it. But again, I'm going to try and ask something simple, because it's the only way that I can learn a bit myself. One of the things that's obsessing me at the moment is the difference between being central and the sort of spreadsheet, everything moving all the time, and time is moving along. And I noticed that your examples of altars and so forth, everything is always central place. There's always, a ruler or Christ or some being that is the central to everything. And all the paintings seem at first like a perspective with a vanishing point, and it's all one place. And I would compare that with spreadsheets where, you never stop. And I suppose you could say that rituals are like is repetition, and what you're trying to do is to make time out of time, as you say. And I get that, but I'm starting to get a natural aversion to central place theory, and think it's very childish, and me, and that one has to pull out of that and reject people who try to impose hierarchies, central place, rulership, all that on you, because it flattens the situation. It denies some creativity, even if some of that creativity is judged to be rather basic. And so my current agon is about fighting central place theory and trying to find a way of seeing a spreadsheet ontology that you're moving along. Yes, there's bits of repetitive ritual, but you don't try and impose that. You surf, you layer. Your horizon is looking at other spreadsheets without judgment, and just because you're trying to get more understanding of how things interact when they do, and you share things when you can, and when you can't, you perhaps move away. And so that it's more like flows of water than it is repeated ritual. I'm sure that is very simplistic compared to what you've been telling us, but if you could just connect me up a bit, perhaps I could learn a bit more.
No, I was thinking you'd ask a question similar to this, actually. We've had these discussions before.
Yes. Well, sorry.
A couple of things. First of all, layers of repetition. When I asked the question, is breakfast a ritual? There are, is greeting somebody a ritual? There are typicalities and there's typicality. And one of the things, and so there's kind of layers, you know, I don't think brushing my teeth has the same significance as breakfast. On the other hand, I don't think breakfast has the same significance as, you know, marriage or baptism or some other ceremony. And I think there are, and I would put in between those something like a drama, which I can repeat, or a book that I can repeat, but, you know, gathers together meanings that force me to reflect upon a larger order. Just park that for a minute. The second thing is its relation to power. I think perhaps we have Foucault, or the fascination with the autonomy of the individual as the vehicle to contest power, where power is seen to be dominance, is, in my view, overdrawn. As I tried to point out with the Mayan ruler, he has absolutely no freedom. He's completely hostage to the conditions which make his world possible. And this is something that you see in many, many traditional cultures. That is to say, one of the extra dimensions to ritual, as opposed to simply, you know, Putin saying, I don't like what's going on, so I'll send my troops in. And all the motifs of power that have grown up around identity politics, is that it in fact deprives the particular of its significance, of its possible to collaborate, of its possible to take the world seriously, of its possibility to commit, rather than to simply become self-involved and surrender to a kind of flux of time, a sort of finitude of accumulation and private pleasures. And what you're calling the spreadsheet existence, where you're simply data in a field, is one of those motifs that modernism has certainly produced, though it's really, you see things like bureaucracies in archaic societies, and it's quite likely that written language grew out of bureaucracies. I would class them in the hierarchy of repetitions. Their capacity for representation, and therefore one's own capacity for representation, is diminished. There is in all of this an element of commitment, and the Christians recognize this in the term faith, and you know, from which the hermeneutic circle comes. And it's again like the Merleau-Ponty's language. Things are left out for the sake of the things that are gained, and that fluctuates. What we certainly don't have is an understanding of the whole that includes human beings, rather than simply disposes them on the opposite side of well-being, and to which we can collectively commit. And it's possible that the climate crisis will force us to. Very literally. But it isn't a developed hermeneutics. So I would say that a lot of people, a lot of architects are taking these issues seriously, even if it's only, they're discovering a kind of non-aesthetic approach to architecture, rooted in deeper processes, which, you know, has a promise. It promises to challenge from the concrete dimension the overvaluation of the noetic, the intellection, the metamorphosis of everything in division and emblematics. I.e., you have to be involved in order for it to reveal its deeper meanings.
That's very, very helpful, and I actually completely agree, and I understand that. And thank you very much for that affirmation. Yeah, thank you very much.
Good to see you again, Maurice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. I'm aware of a growing list. So could we, Dagmar, you had a question, please.
Yes, hi, Peter. Really
Hi,
good
Dagmar.
to hear you. I had a question about something you mentioned right at the outset, which is the problem that most people these days have forgotten the traditions, don't understand these kind of traditions, architectural traditions, ecclesiastical traditions. I think it's a real issue for architecture constantly. I mean, the sort of the demise or the forgetting of the tradition at the beginning of the modern period, or I suppose in the 19th century, and subsequently, has forced people like particularly gifted and imaginative people like Le Corbusier to invent this fantastically complex and fairly arcane symbolic system that he has devised, which is then interpreted by scholars such as yourself in fantastic ways. But to most people who go to the Swiss Pavilion or even stay at the Swiss Pavilion, I think a lot of this iconography remains hidden. You know, it doesn't communicate because we just don't have the understanding of the traditions anymore. And I think a lot of Corbusier's iconography isn't particularly accessible. So I'm just wondering what architects can do these days, given that not too many Le Corbusiers are likely to emerge in the immediate future. Is there some way to kind of educate people about, as academics are doing, about the traditions of the Baroque church, for example, or more likely, is that lost forever?
Two things. One, Le Corbusier's iconography is arcane because you're not used to seeing a wine glass and its inverted double as anything other than a wine glass that I've got to clean. One of them needs cleaning because it spilled all the wine on the table. Or, you know, the Max box has been ruined. In fact, when you work through it, it's got a lot of resonances with the tradition, and you could argue that he is aspiring to a reinterpretation of the tradition, which in turn suggests that this reinterpretation is the way the tradition stays alive, that as soon as it becomes ossified as a dogma, it's dead. And you end up with a pursuit of beauty, you know, it's like in the 19th century. Where you have a whole set of rules and it's still ugly. But the more beautiful it is, the more ugly it is. And the center of gravity of the Le Corbusier building is the situational structure. People respond to Le Corbusier buildings, you know, they don't. One of the things that came up in one of the earlier discussions on this in these seminars is whether to judge beauty according to whether it felt noble or something. I think that's just you end up in Wagner and Rudolf Otto by, you know, it's like pursuing the sublime. And one of the things I give Le Corbusier credit for is that he's articulated a kind of middle ground. There's no question that he's framed it as a kind of gnosis, because he feels like you do, that nobody understands. And so he needs to organize it, and he needs it to be something like a doctrine. Now, the doctrine is most explicitly manifest in the poem, and this has very little to do with architecture. I mean, architecture appears in level 2 and in Caractères level as something that you can create. Otherwise, it's about, you know, coincidentia positorum. I brought this all up to the Dominican, to some of the Dominicans and standing in La Tourette, and they were absolutely thrilled they said that the coincidentia positorum is a very precise moment in Christian theology. This is absolutely up our street. Any rate, this relates in part to what Christian was asking regarding knowledge. Le Corbusier suggests that if you take things like the way you handle glasses and plates seriously, the way you dispose them on the table, you're on the meaning of table as a kind of proto-landscape, as having a kind of quasi-sacrificial content. You're on your way to taking your life more seriously. Now, whether, I'm not going to live my life like Le Corbusier. Well, I don't have much left, but I'm certainly not going to live with Le Corbusier as a model. But as a reasonable stab at what's called for, I think it merits the work I've spent on it. I mean, I think I had a discussion with David about Lucan, and he recommended a very interesting book to me or a couple of books on the Dominican monastery, which I dutifully read. And what struck me was that it was a lovely, lovely description of the building, but kind of what makes one remember Lucan wasn't captured in it, or in the parts that I read. And what makes Lucan, why I'm not worried about Lucan using thinking he's being cheap by using a Cistercian apse to represent the room, is the kind of thing that I didn't find in the book. And Lucan has a lot of really, really interesting things to say about architecture, and obviously some incredibly compelling designs. As I was saying to David, and I think David agrees, he's somebody who deserves being brought back into the limelight. But in general, the tradition is renewed. What's missing, of course, is the collaborative element of it, the degree to which it's shared. And people probably want it shared at the level of iconography before they want it shared at the primary level. And it's easier if it's iconography. Whereas at the primary level, the question is constantly alive. And, it takes time. I mean, the Mayans lasted longer than we have, but, as a kind of basic civilization, certainly longer than the USA. And, in all these cultures, you see renewals and reinterpretations. I mean, the degree to which early Christian architecture is still present at least up to the 19th century. And in fact, the buildings that most people respect, the modernist churches that most people respect, they tend to gravitate around the Romanesque more than they gravitate around, either Gothic or Baroque. And one can understand, I mean, I do too. Much as, the cultural conditions by which the Baroque is possible is something much, much bigger than a church, where, a bunch of talented sculptors and stucco artists and fresco artists. I mean, the mere capacity that everybody from the archbishop down to the guy holding the mason's shit away can communicate with each other to produce that building is something that's unusual in our culture. The degree to which there is, that Neumann can, he doesn't have the frescoes, he doesn't have the sculptures in there. In fact, that altar was done by a guy from his office, because Neumann had died by that time, though he'd obviously indicated where it was in his basic character. And those kind of moments are, or something like Constantinople under Justinian. I mean, the degree to which cisterns communicated with palaces, communicated with churches, communicated with bath buildings is extraordinary. Didn't you see that in in Islamic culture, in places like Isfahan, or there's bits of it left in Bukhara, in Samarkand, but most of it's gone. But you know, we probably can't live with that intensity of focus. We absolutely need the noise as much as we resent it.
Could I ask maybe that we, Dagmar, just move with reference to David, please?
Yeah.
You're muted, David, sorry.
Maybe it's better that I'm muted. A question about the beginning and ending, Peter. Ugly truth and ideal beauty. I was thinking at the end about the plan of Pavillon Suisse, but also the chapel wall at La Tourette. And obviously, as you said at the end, one is horizontal, the other vertical. You also set out at the beginning a tension between austerity and articulation. Is it the case then that the plan articulation of Pavillon Suisse, the subject matter being situated life, has a kind of ugliness, but truth? Is that what the title was getting at? I'm sorry it's too facile, but
No.
I was thinking that there is something very beautiful about the emptiness of that austere wall in the chapel. And it's certainly visible, unlike the plan, which one has to be in and move through and participate in the concreteness of a situated existence, which struck me as maybe a domain of articulation that isn't automatically symbolic, though you converted it beautifully into something legible. But I thought maybe those two elements of his work, the plan and the wall, as to some degree true, and perhaps on the other hand ideal. Maybe those were part of what you were getting at with your title.
Right. First of all, as usual, good question. First of all, that title and little synopsis was written when Jose invited me, like last summer.
So you're that precocious.
Exactly. It sort of hung around as whether austere, I mean, one of the aspects of austere, of course, for modernism was the Japanese 17th century, and by which a dignity was conferred upon, you know, simplicity. And of course, in the Japanese context, it's also aristocratic. It's also a highly refined, you know, rikyu, the cultivation of the simple, in, you know, an insight that's very valuable. The notion of ideal came out of the diatoma comment, but also out of the attachment people have to geometry as something that lies beyond and pragmatics and even form, and endows a building with rationality or intentionality or spirit. Whereas, of course, for Plato, it was a kind of propedeutic for dialectics. And I was particularly intrigued by the, whereas the geometry for something like Villestein at Monzy sets it in an order that's, yes, dynamic, because things are playing off each other, but it has none of the violence of the structure for Pavillon Suisse. And the way Ronchamp plays with the modular is also this interesting mixture of violence and harmony that is most explicit in the door, and which uses an analogous but completely different geometric structure. And the idea of a geometric structure having a story to tell. It's not simply, you know, the sort of Rudolf Wittkover. It's all trying to, you know, cosmic harmony is a single chord. You know, sort of G major played across the full span of the piano, as it were. And it's like a lot of there's a guy named O'Connell, a Jesuit, who did an interesting study of Augustine's what he called aesthetics, which culminates in a kind of praise of the Augustine de Musica, culminates in, you know, geometry and number, and the leftover of the tradition of Neo-Pythagorean Platonism, Neoplatonism, that whole little corpus. And he spends the whole concluding chapter attempting to rescue it from what he calls abstraction. And in many ways, Le Corbusier is right that there is a convergence of the capacities for things to dissolve and drift away from each other and become, you know, mush or unrelated, that's directly related to their capacity to be related, to be geometrically precise, to confer a kind of measure, to be aligned, that those two moments in balance, or where the order is coming from and where, you know, human finitude keeps track of both its own finitude and its capacity to participate in a larger order. And so to a certain extent, Ugly Truth and Ideal Beauty was a provocation that brings them together through something like the conflict of opposites, something like the, and I'm intrigued by this business of the latent world, yes, holding the promise of, as it were, participation in the world soul, but also holding the threat of dissolution into meaningless, into, you know, just filling out time, into, because what is latent to experience is both. You know, one has the capacity to simply dissolve into the requirements of, you know, immediate requirements of hunger, disease, or whatever, as much as to indulge through the reflection or just sharing or helping somebody, or to something that's more like commitment, that's something more like acknowledging one's obligation to a larger whole, which in our case, I mean, Heidegger had it as the fourfold. And the most ambiguous aspect of Heidegger's fourfold is God's. We have no trouble with earth and sky. We have no trouble with humans, but God's is definitely an issue in our culture. So
but
what
I did want to say, Peter, that your geometrical rendering of that very curious corner in the refectory was quite a revelation, because the structuring of the plan and the configuration of spaces, particularly around the foyer, has a delightful and fantastic quality to it. But to make apparent as you did in the geometrical interpretation of that room, the structure and its coherence, or the participation of those parts into some kind of order, is perhaps joining together the ugly truth and ideal beauty. At least that's the way I've been reading this, and it's actually, for me, this is quite a wonderful gift you've presented today, because one generally oscillates between the kind of purest dream and the more concrete and sensible dimensions of the Corbusian space, but it's rare to see a person able to bind those together, as you did in that account.
Well, that's very nice to say. I'm only following Corb.
We've got a kind of time limit, which
okay.
I do. There are still questions. If I can move to Nicholas Temple, please, is that possible?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the paper, Peter, and I've got a number of questions, but the one that I'd particularly be interested in exploring is really in the context of the photographs, Le Corbusier's interest in photographic records of his buildings, and in the context of perspective. I think there's something kind of interesting about how we actually understand the compelling nature of the photograph and your analysis of it, your interpretation of it. To me, it's almost as if the photograph becomes a kind of form of disclosure, of revelation of the space, perhaps even more compelling than the building in a strange way. And I'm kind of interested in this, thinking about the Stand della Segnatura and the dispute and your analysis of it, and looking at Le Corbusier, looking at Dalibor Wesley's issue about perspective as a kind of way of introducing the greater emphasis on horizontality, between essentially the corporeal world and this notion of a quasi infinitesimal space over and above this idea of the vertical world, between the divine and the human, and to what extent the photographs that we see, and particularly the one that you analysed brilliantly in the context of the Swiss Pavilion, is a kind of reflection of Le Corbusier himself battling with this relationship in the context of the room as a kind of condition of reinterpreting the interrelationships between the transcendent and the immanent in the modern world. And it seemed to me that the way in which you unfolded this through geometry and through the kind of threading together of different symbolic elements of the space seemed to me to be really interesting. It opened up a whole series of doors for me in my own particular interest of pictorial space. So it's just an observation, but I thought there's something very specific. I've always been intrigued by Le Corbusier's photographs and your analysis, or your interpretation of them, but this one to me seemed particularly revealing.
Yeah. When I refer to there's no question that he uses his photographs as something halfway between his paintings and the actual architecture. And, you're not supposed to lay out your morning breakfast like his photograph. It's something that has an emblematic value that stands for what the room is or is meant to be. And yes, sanctuary is a metaphor, a vague metaphor. It's that table that is more important to it than, say, the ceiling, and its configuration in the rest of the building. When I say that he demands a kind of purist vision, frontalities and obliques and this kind of thing are the key ways that you experience his buildings. And you flatten things so that they become emblematic. It's in that form that they can participate in this iconographic universe that he's concocted. And in that sense, they're very much like, 16th, 17th century emblems, and particularly the alchemical imagery was much more important to him than the stories. He couldn't read the stories and they're very boring anyway. As it's something more horizontal than vertical, his verticals tend to cross horizons. So like the thing at Alger, or if you look at the discussion of in urbanism, of the sun setting on those glass skyscrapers viewed from the cemetery-like qualities of the, what's the name of that garden? It's the one in the north that has the Ledoux Barrière, the little tiny one.
Parc Monceau.
Thank you, that's it. Where he has Parc Monceau rendered in shadow and dripping water, and you have this crystalline sunlight reflecting off the west side of these glass skyscrapers. He does something similar in his scheme for Addis Ababa, where he has one of his lens-like buildings, and the sun reflects off this all day except at noon, and because of the cant, it goes dark. And that's what happened in his studio. The skylights were oriented east-west, and at noon it went dark, and then started to lighten up again in the afternoon. And that attunement to the horizon, which is, it just absolutely permeates the Poème de Langledois and its imagery, and is more important to him and is the key to his, what he calls terrestrial existence or something, some such word like that. And therefore to the human drama. I mean, he hardly ever looks up. His ceilings are notably, I mean, the chapel at Fermeny is unusual in this respect, even if it replicates a church that he designed back in the 30s, which, God, I can't remember his name. I interviewed him when I was in the Fondation, described as an upside down church. I.e., it was meant to be chthonic. And whether this is directly related to perspectivity or the legacy of perspectivity is an open question. I can see why you might ask it, because that purest vision is essentially frontal. And the only images he shows that are oblique are of outsides of buildings. It's very, very rare for him to shoot a corner like that, and with a table skewed across it. I mean, it's a very unusual image. And it's only after studying the building you realize why that corner mattered to him so much. It's like a knot where everything comes together. And he would do things, I mean, one of the things about modernism is that they get rid of temples and rebuild the world from the bottom up, from houses. Whereas traditional culture would start with the temple and derive the house from the temple. Modernism, really from the 19th century onwards, does the reverse. It builds from the bottom up. And so this sort of domestic symbolism is built into how architectures. And I mean, there's an aspect of that chapel in La Tourette. I'm actually much more fascinated by the rest of the building than I am by the chapel. I think he won with the chapel, but there's also a kind of sublime to it, a kind of great dark void that I find slightly cloying. In a way that Lucan is able to pull off. On the other hand, Lucan can take a basic house and make it seem like a temple, and I think we're getting a little too pious here. And so it's a real. I mean, that's just my judgment, and I wouldn't make a general rule out of that. But it's one of those things that's really, really difficult for contemporary architecture. I mean, you simply don't build. And when you get things like atria, John Portman or Patrick Schumacher, you want to vomit. I mean, they're just visual plug holes, that spiral into the void. And that business of developing a vertical order. I mean, I don't know what you think of the concert hall in Barcelona. It's right on the edge of being able to understand how to do that still. It's not something we do. I mean, vaults are just, people put them on buildings, but they tend to look like the little funeral chapels that Fabio just sent me one from Campoverano. You get a concrete vault standing on 4 spare columns with a tomb and some sculpture in it, and you just, it's just abject. And that's where it derives, from which it derives its power, because so much of Rome is full of articulation. But whether we should be articulating it, I'd probably prefer that we spent our effort doing things like stucco lustro than, Bitcoin or driving cars. But that's the personal preference. That does have to do with where one's priorities lie.
Okay, I think there's just one question left. If you could be brief, Mark, that would be appreciated. So Mark Power, please.
Mark, hi.
Hi, Peter. Thanks very much. It's good to see you again, and a lot of familiar faces. Well, I was just really going to sort of ask about in the situation we're in with a sort of comedian facing up to I don't know, is he a Mayan ruler? I'm not sure. Trapped in his sort of essay and what have you. A
sane comedian confronting a tragic comedian.
Yeah, well, quite. So yeah, this sort of comes from having also thought a little bit after Christian's talk about festival. I was thinking of, I suppose, what we might regard as being a contemporary festival, let's say, for the sake of argument, a comedy festival. And when a comedian sort of tells a joke, and I'll give you an example so that we've got something to think about. I want to die in my sleep like my father, not screaming in terror like his passengers. And the sort of obviously the joke relies on the last word to, as it were, take you from a sort of charming, perhaps domestic scene of the end of life to a sort of a terrible catastrophe of public responsibility. The way that the word sort of passengers works in the joke is, I guess, sort of akin to one of these sort of thresholds that we've been talking about, this sort of revelatory thresholds. And the burst of laughter, which I noticed didn't attend this, is sort of sudden and shared. And I just wonder if there's anything that might, perhaps be seen in that sort of parallel between a sort of comedy situation and the sort of built environment.
It's a good question. One of the things that's always struck me with the Mayans is the absence of an apparent sense of humor. But of course, 99% of what the Popol Vuh is not terribly full of humor, or even full of optimism. At any rate, I was going to say 99% of what they do is a loss. One of the things about public festival, and if the punchline Okay, two things. I'm trying to say two things at once. First of all,
brilliant. That's fantastic.
yeah, I'll do it in two-part harmony. Speaking out of my bottom and my top simultaneously.
It's the ugly truth and the ideal beauty all at once. Yep.
Yes. First of all, it was Kierkegaard who brought my attention to the confluence of wit and tragedy in Socrates, and how both lay claim to what you hold in common. What is, in terms of the question regarding experience, Christian's question regarding experience earlier, the degree to which what you hold in common, as it were, unconsciously, is actually quite articulate. But secondly, and to me, the paradigm of this is somebody like Joyce, where the two are just running side by side almost at every turn. But secondly, your question about public festival is interesting. I mean, one of the questions that falls out of what I was working with was whether we could have a temple, whether we're in the position, could we invent a new temple, or are we in the position of reusing the ones we already have? Or having no temples, or, is it like Pavillon Suisse? It's all a bunch of little references to a possible temple that exists on the other side of the l'espace indicible. And it's like the question of a public festival. What the thing that's missing is the collective commitment and the commitment to a collective, i.e. the individualism is such that there's a huge amount of shared decorum, and you can walk the streets of most cities in safety. But this doesn't go much further than the golden rule of not injuring somebody else.
Yes.
It doesn't get developed into hermeneutics of what that can mean and how it can be shared, and how in a Mayan household you have a scraggly god made out of straw and feathers hung on the wall that resonates with the way you care for your children, the way you speak to each other, and the level of well-being is a completely different planet from what we enjoy in Europe. And it's not impossible that it's, as it were, better or more meaningful. But certainly the experience of acclaim is something that most people bristle at, rather than something to enjoy or commit to. And that's certainly the case in the West.
Yeah.
Whether the idea of the autocratic ruler who can control the communications is winning, because it's reported that many Chinese are reassured by the authoritarian control, and certainly China has had very limited experience of democracy in its 5,000 years of history. And the one thing they're afraid of is the kind of that meeting that I showed you of a guy named Wang Man, who was an ardent Confucianist in the midst of the Han Dynasty. It was a kind of interruption, and he cared for the poor, and he invented ways of redistributing money, and he really put off the prevailing noble family, the Liu, who mobilized the peasants, and poor Wang Mang eventually ended up, being torn to pieces in his palace. People have seen him as a prototype for the ideals of socialism. Whether that can be said is another story, but certainly what one's not, and when the ruler is celebrated and one sees him imprisoned in his in his role, it's not about power so much as being the vehicle or one key access to the larger meanings, where the ruler is as vulnerable as anybody else. Yes, the Chinese ruler has a mandate of heaven, but everybody knows he or she can be replaced.
Yes, yes.
And it's a ceremonial position. It's a way of saying this is the order in which we believe. Now, I don't think that would persuade Westerners. There's all sorts of, I mean, the kind of nostalgia for the primitive has been around for a long, long time. And you see it, as early as Vitruvius as a kind of art, and the attention to early Christian architecture as a way to understand how to do churches as part of this. And it's the game of recognizing what's in play in the origins and being able to contribute to their deeper understanding in terms of current conditions that seems to be, I don't know, it's because it seems to be so difficult for us. It's because of freedoms, because of the sheer population involved. The numbers are staggering. I don't think it's inherent in what's needed to think that understanding. And I don't think it necessarily looks like Finnegan's Wake. As comprehensive and dense and as often funny as it is, there is a definite limit to language, shall we say.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Dubliners still celebrate Bloomsday in Ulysses. But whether that is enough to generate a deeper, sense of civic solidarity, especially in a place like Ireland, is a much more open question. I mean, I think both sides would much rather discuss Joyce than each other.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I with regret, I think we have to call it a day there. But that contribution to collective understanding is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you massively, and a round of applause. Wonderful tour de force. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. You certainly got high marks at dinner for your patience. Hello, Paolo. I only see about 6 of you at a time. Now I've got 8.
Very good. Well, there are a lot, and
blessings. Thank you.
Farewell.
Happy spring.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.